Shawn, one of the things I've been thinking a lot about as a school leader is knowing that we're not completely over COVID, but we are trending in a good direction. Is kind of this next phase and then this next school year is any thoughts or pointers on how we can go about trying to heal our students, try to heal our staff, and how do we get back to, focusing on maybe some of those positive psychology principles when for this last year was all about health and wellness, which are very important, but kind of getting that culture to go to the next level. I just wondered if you had any thoughts or pointers on maybe something we should be thinking about as a school leader.
Well, Joel, as you know, both of my parents were educators. And my mom was a high school English teacher for 30 years. And I know how challenging it is being an educator, watching the work that she was having to do in the classroom to get students to be excited about the world while grading all their papers at night while she has kids of her own in the midst of all the challenges you get with, any type of large level of organization where you have administration and you have teachers and you have parents and you have the kids and all of those are having to come together. And I think that became even more challenging in the midst of COVID. And so much of our attention was focused upon how do we just get through this period? How do we just survive? And I think the challenge that we were seeing in this research as we were trying to study what causes change in the midst of difficult environments was that we actually could see such a dramatic difference in the research between individuals, between students, between educators, between entire organizations that tried to hunker down and get through that period and assume that once that difficult period was over, then things would return back to normal and be better, versus the organizations that in the midst of the challenge actually invested their time, their energy, and their resources in trying to change the conversation. So not just here's why stress is bad for us, here's how even in the midst of stress that there are enhancing moments, that when our brains perceive meaning, we could actually improve the way that we respond to the world as well. So my hope as we've been working with schools across the entire country in the midst of this challenge was not just how do we get the educators and the students to survive this past year, but how do we actually find ways of making them actually be able to move forward so that it wasn't just a period of deficits for us, that something about what we've been learning allows us to achieve greater levels of optimism, social connection, and well-being than we've ever had in the past. One of the challenges we know is that mental health and the well-being of our students is a high priority. Given what we just experienced, for the first time in the midst of doing this research, it's so incredibly clear that that has to be the first step if we're going to be able to move forward. So what I'm seeing out of the school leaders like yourself, Joel, that are trying to find a way of making this a better world for these students and the educators and the parents and the community is that before we can get back to getting those test scores high, before we can get back to making sure that we're teaching the right things in the classroom, before we can do any of that, we actually have to lay the groundwork of the social and emotional learning that would allow for that to occur in the first place. And the starting place for that seems to be the educators themselves, right? If we're not doing social and emotional support for the people who are leading and teaching social emotional learning, I learned this from you, Joel, we're not going to actually be able to make the type of changes we want. And that's something you've seen. You've seen this for years as you've tried to implement these policies way before COVID hit, way before that this was in the forefront of people's mindset as they were trying to think about what school was for. You've been focused on as an educator. So maybe you could talk a little bit about what you've been doing to do that and how successful you've been, because I think that gives us a model for what we could hope for our schools as we move forward.
Yeah. One of the things I was thinking about, Shawn, is when we started in 2015 with, kind of the organized 2015. We read your book, and then we started with the Orange Frog and through AASA. But I just am so glad that we had many of those things in place. It was like our culture was built, not that we ever planned for a pandemic, but we were kind of built for a culture of what lens we were going to see things, how were we going to stay calm, how we were going to continue to understand that together we were going to be able to get through this, coming off some of the big potential research. So I just think going back to, like you said, your culture, when you build it around positive psychology, it just seems like it's very resilient and it can last and you can get through things. Doesn't mean bad things aren't going to happen. It doesn't mean hopefully not another pandemic, but we were able to go faster and I think have more success because we had already kind of built a culture of of resiliency, and also some positivity. So